This is Business Exit Stories. Today we're here with Ian MacLachlan. Ian, would you just take a minute or two and talk a little bit about your company, a little bit about where you're located, and then we can jump in and chat a little bit about some of the transactions you've been involved in over the years. So, Ian, give us some background on yourself and your company.
Sure. I founded Business Team in 1982 as a business brokerage and lower middle market brokerage firm. And we've done about 7,000 transactions since then. Small businesses under 100 million in revenues, privately held. We are generalists. We do all types of businesses. We have offices on the West Coast from Southern California up to Seattle. And that about is the story of Business Team.
Okay, well, great. And so 7,000 transactions over the last multiple decades. You probably have come across some unique and challenging situations when you're representing the sellers. I guess you're primarily on the sell side. Is that right?
Actually, we're dual agents in almost every situation. We're the listing agent and we usually represent the buyer. I mean, we do work with outside brokerage firms if they have a buyer, but the industry typically is closed in terms of dealing with outside brokers.
So let's talk a little bit about some of those transactions you've been involved in that didn't go all that well, maybe closed. You were able to hold it together to get them across the closing line. Why don't you share something, maybe something more recent? I mean, I know you've been doing this for decades, but maybe something more recent that kind of reflects some of the challenges that buyers and sellers have when they're dealing in exiting a business.
Well, one that comes to mind is a janitorial business that we sold about a year or so ago, and it was quite profitable.
So when you say janitorial, you're talking about commercial businesses, right?
Yes.
Going into offices and things of that nature and doing large-scale janitorial, I guess would be a way to put it.
Yes. They had large office buildings and other businesses that they did maintenance for.
So when you say they, was this husband and wife, partners? What type of operation was it?
It was two brothers, and they were partners.
And just getting to that age where they wanted to step out of the business and retire, that was the driver to consider selling?
Yes, it was, and something they had started planning for maybe a year or so earlier.
So how did the transaction unfold?
Well, buyer made an offer, and it was accepted, and then entered into a due diligence phase and signed off and close the transaction.
I imagine that these size of transactions in a janitorial business, it involves some sort of financing. What type of financing was involved here? Was it a traditional bank loan or was it an SBA loan?
It was an SBA loan, and you probably know the SBA does their own due diligence. They get the tax returns directly from the IRS and have their team go through the financials to support the loan. Shortly after, though, the closing, the buyers found out that the sellers had been skimping on the service for some time, missing scheduled visits, cutting back on personnel.
So let me understand that comment there. When you say skimping on services, so traditionally janitorial service like this comes in once a week or twice a week to do the janitorial work and do the cleaning. And what you're saying is that they really started cutting back on that, even though they probably had an agreement or a contract in place that required them to be there on a set schedule or multiple times during a month, and they just started to cut back. What was the motivation for doing that? Just bad operations, or was there some ulterior motive going on here?
Well, hard to pin down the motive, but one possibility is that they wanted to lower their costs. The huge cost in that business is labor. And so if the contract calls for 5 days a week maintenance and you skip a day or two, or you send out, instead of 3 people, you send out 1, then costs go down, margins improve, and the business looks more profitable.
So you made an interesting comment a little earlier that these were brothers that started planning in advance, a year or two in advance. They started thinking about selling, and somewhere along that line, they figured that, well, if we have bigger and better margins, that's going to drive more to the bottom line, and that's going to increase the value of our business. And so we get a higher price for selling if we can show better profitability. And the way they were going to show better profitability was, as you say, quote, skimping on services. And I'm just curious, did anyone pick up on that during due diligence?
No, neither the bank nor the buyers, one of whom was quite sophisticated. It just didn't occur. And they could possibly have learned about it if they had done some customer surveys prior to closing.
So what would that have looked like if you, looking back on this right now for our audience out there, anticipating that they're going to be exiting, and so a buyer may do a customer survey, what would that look like? In this particular situation, if you had the benefit of hindsight, what should the buyers have probably done, and what would that survey have looked like?
Well, first off, there was some customer concentration. Some of the clients of the business were accounted for a large portion of the revenue.
That's even more problematic.
Yes, it is. Yeah. So there are companies that will do independent QC surveys for you.
QC meaning quality control?
Right. Customer satisfaction. Or they could do it themselves, posing as people just trying to gauge, let the owners know if customers are satisfied.
You're saying that they could call up and say, I'm thinking of using ABC commercial janitorial service here. How's your experience been? And are you happy with the service type of thing? That's what you're talking about?
Right.
But they didn't do any of that, huh? And they just thought the margins were great. And apparently the SBA loan committee and that looked at this loan and the financial statements, they didn't pick up on anything that was unusual, I guess. They just looked at the margins and the profitability and stamped approved on the loan application.
Yes, they did. And the tip-off might have been the change in margins over the last year.
I would imagine that if you're cutting back on services and let's say they go maybe twice a week and they cut back on 1 week out of the month, that's 25%. So that would be a dramatic drop in labor associated with the cost of providing the services and a pretty big jump in margins over the last year or so. That should have been a red flag anyway.
Yes, in hindsight, certainly. But in general, when there's a customer concentration issue, that QC should be attended to.
And for our audience out there, the customer concentration, do you recall what that was? Was it 20%, 30%, 50%? Do you remember exactly how much that concentration was focused?
I don't remember exactly. I think if I recall, the business was doing about $5 million, and there were one or two customers that were doing 20 or 15%.
That can become problematic if they decide to leave. And I guess if they aren't getting the service they expected, the probability of them leaving is pretty high. And what happened? So the buyers bought the business and they started noticing that customers weren't happy and they started canceling contracts. Is that kind of how the story goes here?
Yes, defection had already taken place and also complaints had been mounting. And that's when it came out that the service cutbacks had occurred. So the buyers did immediately lose some business.
And what happened? I mean, did the business struggle and the buyers just buck it up and try to build back up the business? Did they approach the sellers? What happened?
Well, the business immediately turned into a negative cash flow situation, even though they had a payment forgiveness for the SBA, a 6-month program.
So this was during the pandemic?
Yes.
So for those in the audience, the SBA loan provisions allowed 6 months of payments to be forgiven under certain criteria. And that was a big help, I'm sure, when you're borrowing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to buy a business. Those forgiveness of monthly loan payments can become substantial. So they qualified for that and were given the benefit of having that to help increase their cash flow. What else happened?
The buyers sued the sellers once they had verified that the business was in different shape than what they had been told. And they settled quite quickly in mediation. And they still had challenges with the business. Some of the employees, a number of employees had left. There was some dissatisfaction. There were buyers themselves were partners, and one of the partners had, I guess, got so burned out with the experience that he opted to leave the partnership, and so the business was put back on the market and resold.
And do you know if the buyers came out underwater or even, or did they make a little money after reselling the business?
I think they came out even. They were fortunate in a number of ways. The loan forgiveness was a big help. The settlement, the mediation settlement was a big help.
Well, I guess if we're looking in what can be learned from a transaction like this, what would you say the two big takeaways are in this transaction?
I would say that the major takeaway is if there's customer concentration, you absolutely should insist upon some kind of survey. And if the customers had been smaller, 1 or 2%, and some of them had defected, it wouldn't make any difference. That should have taken place. The other, perhaps more difficult to put your finger on, would be the change in margins. Why did that happen? And perhaps there should have been some interviewing of some of the management other than the owners. Of course, sellers don't like that to take place because that blows the confidentiality of the sale.
Yeah, it's kind of a challenging environment where the owners want to keep the sale under wraps so that people don't get freaked out and decide that they aren't going to have a job and go looking for a job. So there's always a tightrope to walk. But in this particular case, there were probably some other things they could have done to satisfy themselves on the customer concentration and the relative happiness of, the customers. Were they pleased with the service and things of that nature? But to me, the most telling thing is that all of a sudden the margins go, and I'm just pulling numbers out of the air here, but margins go from a cost of sales type of margin, jumps 10%, jumps 15%. Why did that happen? Is it just good management, or was there something else underlying the quite dramatic changes in margin over a relatively short period of time? That should have been a red flag. When I'm quite surprised that the bank didn't kind of pick up on that either, especially an SBA loan where the criteria that you have to meet, it's kind of like jumping through hoops sometimes.
Yeah, although sometimes they get hung up on the wrong information, but they certainly missed it here.
They missed it this one. So I guess what you're telling me is that when they sold, they were lucky to get out with their finances intact. They didn't lose a bunch of money. They lost a lot of time and probably got a few gray hairs from the experience, but in a stressful situation, so much so that one of the partners decided to bail and not continue with the business, which I guess triggered the other partner not wanting to really continue with the business and to put it back up for sale. So, I guess for our audience out there that are listening in, if you're a seller looking to position that business for an exit someday, is that you want to take a look at those type of issues, knowing that, the buyers are going to do some type of due diligence, and you have to think ahead of what that due diligence is going to be and how you can prepare for it. So appreciate you sharing that story. That's a kind of a little bit different twist on a story that we haven't heard about in a long time here on the podcast.